Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It looks like we have about 45 minutes together. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of a roadmap, and we'll get into the weeds a bit and come out and hopefully have a good conversation during Q&A. The two main concepts that I want to talk about as concepts in early American political thought are the rule of law and the moral limits of sovereign power. What does it mean to have something that is the rule of law as opposed to just the imposition of power on somebody else? What does it mean to be authoritative, to be able to authoritatively make law? And what are the limits to what a sovereign can do once we identify who has authority to make law, who has authority to wield political power? What are the limits of that authority? Where do they come from? How do we know what they are? These are the kinds of questions that Martin Luther King Jr. asked when he was imprisoned in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And you probably know the story. It was just after Easter Sunday. He had been arrested for marching without a permit. He's sitting in Birmingham City Jail, and he opened the newspaper and he read a response to his actions from a group of white Alabama clergymen, and they accused him of being unwise, imprudent, untimely with his civil disobedience in Birmingham, that he should have waited for a just resolution to come about through the political process rather than engaging in civil disobedience. And so he wrote on the margins of the newspaper a response, and that response we now know as King's letter from Birmingham jail. And in the response, he wove together strands from the classical and biblical traditions. He drew on Socrates, the Hebrew prophets, St. Paul, Jesus, Augustine, Aquinas, Martin Buber, Paul Tillich, among others. And he marshaled them all to support his argument that nonviolent civil disobedience was, in this case, morally justified. And the reason it was morally justified, he argued, was because the law of segregation was itself unjust. And because it was unjust, he said it was defective. And in a crucial Augustinian sense, quoting from St. Augustine, he said, "An unjust law is no law at all." And then coming to the crux of the argument, King asked rhetorically, how does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? And he offered this answer. He said, "A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law." To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, King said, an unjust law is a human law that's not rooted in eternal and natural law. In that moment, King was drawing on the classical Christian natural law tradition as it had been represented in its high watermark by Thomas Aquinas. And King had been exposed to that and learned that tradition in his PhD program in philosophical theology at Boston University. And that tradition remained, in its various permutations, a dominant influence in the American founding period. And it was not, as is sometimes suggested, displaced in the founding era by theologically subversive, modern, and secular theories of natural law. And this is a common argument. This is the argument that we argue against in our book. And you see this in a couple of different ways in the intellectual conversation right now about the American founding. One is captured by the title of Matthew Stewart's book. Matthew Stewart's a philosopher. He has a recent book out called Nature's God. And then the subtitle is The Heretical Origins of the American Republic. And his argument is that this emphasis in the American founding on the laws of nature and nature's God is really a way to subvert the Christian tradition and to put something heretical in its place, and hence the subtitle, The Heretical Origins of American Politics. And in reality, he sees this as a game among philosophers to transplant that older tradition and put in its place something like a modern, individualistic, maybe pantheistic emphasis on nature, but without the theological doctrines associated with it within Christianity. You see something similar, an agreement on that fundamental point in a very different take. I think Stewart celebrates that fact. And Patrick Deneen has a book that was very popular recently. He's a political scientist at Notre Dame University, and it was called Why Liberalism Failed. And I think he agrees with the fundamental diagnosis of the founding in terms of what it was doing, and he laments that fact. And so sometimes it's celebrated, sometimes it's lamented, but there's this idea that the American founding stands for something subversive of this older tradition. King, I think, is helpful here because he was rooted in the categories of the American political tradition as he's appealing to this older understanding of natural law. Just a few months after King's letter from Birmingham jail, he then gave his most famous speech, the one that we know him for, the I Have a Dream speech, standing in front of the Lincoln Monument, looking out at the National Mall in Washington. And he began his speech, as you remember, 50 years ago, and in that counting by score, he's pointing back 100 years to 1863. And with Lincoln in the background, 1863 is when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But it was also when Lincoln gave his most famous speech in the same year, delivered at the dedication of the cemetery at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And Lincoln, of course, is also counting by score. He begins that speech by saying 77 years ago. And that 77 points back to 1776, a time, Lincoln says, that through the crucible of war, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. King's appeal to Lincoln on the occasion of the March on Washington served a political purpose. He was enlisting the sacred symbols and narratives of American politics in the cause of civil rights. And he was pushing at that time for passage of the civil rights legislation that President Kennedy had proposed just a few weeks before on June 19th, 1963. A date full of significance for those who have long celebrated it as a day of jubilee, and of course, beginning with the proclamation of freedom to those enslaved in Texas, just in Galveston, is where the celebration of Juneteenth began. And in the Declaration of Independence, where Lincoln and King are pointing us back to, those ideas, this constellation of ideas is connected to and justified by an appeal to the laws of nature and of nature's God. Years ago, I was doing graduate school at the University of Texas and wrote a dissertation on natural law and anti-slavery constitutionalism. And in that, I talk about the Declaration of Independence, the appeal to nature's God. One of my dissertation committee members told me afterward that I didn't sufficiently appreciate the tension and perhaps the incompatibility between the God of nature or reason and the God of biblical revelation. And just paraphrasing from memory here, what he said was, nature's God is not the God of Abraham. Natural law is not an adjunct of, but a rival to the divine law. And if you can show otherwise, he said, there's an article or book waiting to be written. And so I tried to, it's been years now, but I've been ruminating on that and tried to remedy it with a book. That question launched me into this research, and the research is an interpretive study of the American founding. It enters into a pretty lively, ongoing scholarly debate right now about the founding and its character, its liabilities. Some of that I mentioned, where people are looking at the founding and seeing it as subversive of this older tradition, either to celebrate that or to bemoan that fact. Other competing narratives right now about the founding, I think you can see something like a Christian nationalism that roots the founding in a more text-based and tradition-based Christianity rather than a philosophical tradition. You see a kind of right rejection of the founding and a left rejection of the founding. You see a left celebration of the founding and a left celebration, or a right celebration of the founding, for different reasons, but it's in a completely contested conversation right now. So our contribution to this conversation is to argue that the natural law tradition that was publicly invoked in the founding era owed more to the classical and Christian tradition, to those influences, than to their modern and secular alternatives. And we develop that argument. We look at different things, the pamphlet debates in the 1760s and 1770s, an analysis of just war theory and the War of Independence, the invocations of providentialism, appeals to providence during the Revolutionary era, separate chapters on Thomas Jefferson and James Wilson, their political thought. But to summarize the conclusions, what we found and what we argue is that there's a particular conception that comes out that has broad support among all these diverse sources. And I'm going to go through these. There are 8 different points make, and stay with me as I go through them. They're all important, and it gives you a sense of what the founding is not according to our view, but it does get us into the weeds just a bit. The first is that natural law has a lawgiver, and that lawgiver is understood as a creator who's separate and distinct from creation, that nature's God is not tantamount to or the same as nature. It's actually the creator, separate and distinct from nature, and that seems to matter. The second is that reason, our ability to reason about things, it also gives us an ability to reason about and to grasp basic human goods, things that are good according to our nature. And those things that we grasp by our reason that are good are real. They're real human goods, rather than being nominal or in name only. It doesn't mean that we just, whatever we describe as good is what we happen to like, that there are things that we could be objectively right or wrong about in describing them as basic human goods. That natural law is prescriptive, that it imposes obligations on us. Once we know what those good things are, we have an obligation to pursue them and to try to cultivate them in our communities. And it's not merely descriptive or offering hypothetical imperatives. It's not the case that we can just observe things about the world, observe natural consequences. If you do this, then you get this. And if you happen to want to be happy, then here's a way to do it based on observation. There's actually a moral obligation. The fourth thing, natural law emanates from the nature of God, in which there's a unity of power and goodness. And so they talk a lot about this. This is a conversation that people are having in the colonial colleges, in philosophical tracts, in political pamphlets. They're talking about the nature of God, and they say power and goodness are unified in the divine nature. And that seems to matter because it tells us something about sovereignty. God's sovereign authority is what grounds moral obligation, and that sovereign authority is not a result of superior physical strength alone, but it's connected to goodness also. Being simply strong or having physical power is not enough. The fifth thing, sovereignty in a rightly ordered political community is modeled or should be modeled after the pattern of divine sovereignty. So as power and goodness is unified in the divine nature, so it should be unified in the political sovereign. And power alone does not confer sovereign authority for human political communities either. Might doesn't make right. The rule of law then means that the sovereign is subject to and bound by a higher law. Absolute sovereignty, understood as the imposition of the sovereign's will, is analytically indistinguishable from tyranny. And what this means in a setting like the United States, with our social contract tradition and the emphasis on the consent of the governed and on popular sovereignty, is that the people who are sovereign, the people do not exercise an absolute sovereignty based on will alone. And because of that, there are limits to what the people can do. Because of that, consent is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the rightful exercise of government power. Just because the people consent, just because we all agree together, majorities agree together to pursue some course of action, that doesn't make it right. And that doesn't make it authoritative. And then finally, natural law is known by reason, independent of any purported divine revelation. But those two things aren't mutually exclusive. There's not a tension between those two things, according to these sources. And so what we consider to be distinctly modern and secular conceptions of natural law by contrast, and I think what people sometimes identify the founding with, is a negation of each one of those things that I had just mentioned. It holds to a pantheistic conception of God, where God and nature are conflated as the same thing. It treats the good as nominal, meaning in name only. There's no reality to goodness. It treats natural law as hypothetical. It's observations about the natural world and conclusions drawn from it. And so we can observe things and order our lives according to those observations, but there's no moral obligation that's imposed to behave in a certain way. Sovereignty is unlimited in this conception. The rule of law is indistinguishable from the rule of will, the imposition of the sovereign's will. And consent-based social contract theories therefore confer unlimited sovereignty on the people as a whole, on majorities. There's no external limit to what they can do. And then finally, reason stands in opposition to revelation. These things are competing concepts and categories, and they're not complementary. And in the book, we call this modern vision Hobbism. The reason we use that term is because it takes its name from the modern political theorist Thomas Hobbes, 17th century English theorist, who was derided fairly universally by the American founders in that generation. And you see the term Hobbism and Hobbist used as that's one insult that you might throw at somebody in a political pamphlet if you wanted to take them down. And it captures this whole constellation of ideas. On that last point, I want to stay on just a bit about reason and revelation and how people are thinking about this. What we find, I think, and fairly consistently in the American political tradition, is that you have appeals to God in American public life, very common appeals to God in American public life, even today, but more so during the founding. But the appeals are to a God known by reason rather than a God known by revelation. What I mean by that is this appeal is often to a God that others are expected to know based on reason, and rather than appeal to a particular denominational or religious tradition. Lincoln provides a typical and illustrative example of this dynamic at work. If you look at Lincoln's writings, he rarely appealed to Jesus in his letters. It's just one example of how this might go. In his letters, orations, public documents, if you search, the collected works of Lincoln are available online. You can do a search for words. If you search his collected works, you'll find over 300 invocations of God, and hundreds more if you start refining terms to include things like the Almighty or Creator. But you get only a few references to Jesus. One of those comes in his debates with Stephen Douglas, who's the senator in Illinois. They're debating each other in the Senate race in Illinois in 1858. They're debating primarily the question of national policy with respect to the expansion of slavery in the federal territories. And Lincoln says this. He quotes directly from Matthew 5:48, one of the times that you might pull a search result if you're looking at Lincoln's works. And he says, "As your Father in heaven is perfect, be ye also perfect." He's quoting directly from Jesus. But only as a metaphor, in this case, to argue that the Declaration of Independence should operate as scripture for the American political order. As he saw it, it should be a standard to approximate in public life, even if it couldn't be fully realized this side of heaven. And so, as Lincoln said, "So I say, in relation to the principle that all men are created equal, let it be as nearly reached as we can." The other famous quote from Jesus that appeared repeatedly in Lincoln's speeches and debates is that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And this was a gospel reference that Lincoln used to underscore the impossibility of maintaining a republican government that is half slave and half free. And so we might ask the question, why so many references to God but so few to Jesus? And Lincoln gave a clue in an 1860 speech at Hartford, Connecticut. He said that the wrongfulness of slavery could be, quote, "clearly proved by natural theology apart from revelation." And in invoking the God of natural theology in public life, Lincoln was well within the mainstream of the American political tradition. It begins in its founding document by appealing to the authority of the laws of nature and of nature's God. And then it affirms the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, that they're all endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And if anything could be proved by natural theology, Lincoln said, it was that, quote, "every man, black, white, or yellow, has a mouth to be fed and 2 hands to feed it, and that bread should be allowed to go to the mouth without controversy." But the premises that complete Lincoln's syllogism were supplied by the Declaration, that God created us equal in natural rights, including the right to eat the bread we earn with our own hands. And in this way, the Declaration becomes, in Lincoln's hands, a kind of American scripture, to borrow the title of Pauline Mayer's book on that topic. And as Lincoln knew well, America's civil or political religion had long taken its bearings from God the Creator, knowable by reason. At the same time, the American civil religion, as Lincoln articulated it, drew powerfully from the Hebrew Bible to reflect and frame the common American imagination in a way that could be affirmed by Christian and non-Christian monotheists alike. And one example of this is in Lincoln's reflections in his second inaugural address. And these words are familiar to us. He said, "If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war. As the woe due to those whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Lincoln's interpretation of the Civil War in his second inaugural address, whether or not it wholly reflected Lincoln's own theological views, appealed to a dominant strand in the American political tradition that affirmed the existence of a creator God who is above and beyond nature, particularly providential in the governance of human affairs, legislator of the natural moral law and its derivative natural rights, just judge of nations and persons, benevolent enforcer of the moral order. That tradition and those concepts were classical and Christian in the sense that they developed from this long Christian engagement with classical philosophy. And they differ in important respects from what we might term modern secular natural law and natural rights theories, those ideas that the founding generation associated with Thomas Hobbes. That set of doctrines, often called Hobbist, corresponds to those two concepts I began with and have something to say about those, the rule of law and the moral limits of sovereign power. We might call Hobbism the rule of law is tantamount to the sovereign's will. The sovereign's right to rule is based on superior power. The measure of good and evil is the will of the sovereign, and consequently there are no moral limits to sovereign political power, since the sovereign will just is the definition of what is good or evil in a commonwealth. Numerous pamphlets and essays in England and the North American colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries attributed those ideas to Hobbes and criticized them. One notable example is the pamphlet that comes from the young Alexander Hamilton in response to the royalist Bishop Samuel Seabury. You might remember, if you saw the Hamilton musical, he makes a cameo. It's the same Samuel Seabury from the musical who Hamilton writes a pamphlet against. And according to Hamilton, writing against this royalist bishop, Seabury, he said, taught that man is free of restraints, of all the restraints of law and government in a state of nature, but that in society the weak must submit to the strong, and strong do what they will. And Hamilton says this of Seabury, he says, there's so strong a similitude between your principles and those maintained by Mr. Hobbes, that in judging from them a person might very easily mistake you for a disciple of his. And in that time, that's a pretty significant insult rather, a put down, to say that you're a disciple of Hobbes. Hamilton took Seabury to task for this alleged enmity to the natural rights of mankind, as he said. Ignorance of natural rights was no excuse in such an enlightened age, but such ignorance did, Hamilton insists, extenuate one's guilt. And so he offered this advice to Seabury. He said, apply yourself without delay to the study of the law of nature. And Hamilton is very recently in the United States at this time. He just got finished with studies. I think he's still ongoing studies. He's 19 years old. So he's, this is a college student calling out the bishop and telling him that he needs to apply himself without delay to the study of the law of nature. And he gives him his syllabus, I'm sure, that he had from King's College. He recommended Grotius, Pufendorf, Locke, Montesquieu, Burlamaqui, along with, quote, other excellent writers on the subject. And for good measure, he drew at length from the works of William Blackstone, whom all young lawyers read, and said the law of nature, Blackstone taught, he's quoting directly from Blackstone now, being coeval with mankind and dictated by God himself, is of course superior in obligation to any other. It's binding over all the globe in all countries and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this, and such of them are valid, derive their authority immediately or immediately from this original. In other words, there's a law of nature. God is the author of the law of nature. It imposes obligation. All human laws derive their authority from that original. That theoretical framework of natural law was pervasive in colonial America. It was firmly embedded in this broader tradition of Anglo-American constitutionalism. This idiom of natural law and natural rights filled the pamphlets and sermons, speeches and treatises, courtroom debates, and legal arguments of a generation of politicians and lawyers in America. And at this point, someone might ask, and I'm glad Professor Church is not here to ask it, aren't all of those theorists that Hamilton pointed to modern? Isn't Blackstone himself in some sense modern, according to how we defined things at the outset? And for those of you who are attuned to that question, I think the answer would be that might be true enough, depending on how we interpret some of those texts. But if we ask how some of the leading lights in the founding generation interpreted those texts and used those thinkers in their works, what we find is that it was mainly to underscore classical ideas. They were willing to criticize these thinkers when they disagreed. They didn't just take them wholesale, and they probably had a different reading than we have. Consider as just one example of this, James Wilson's lectures on law at the College of Philadelphia. And I'll end here with James Wilson as an example and move to take some questions while you have time. James Wilson's lectures begin in the 1790s, and just as a bit of background on Wilson, he's one of the forgotten founders in all sorts of ways, but he's extremely influential. Signed the Declaration of Independence, also signed the Constitution. He's appointed as one of the first members of the United States Supreme Court. While he's sitting on the Supreme Court, he's also appointed to a chair in law at the university, what becomes the University of Pennsylvania, University of Philadelphia. And he is now sitting as a Supreme Court justice. He has signed the Declaration, signed the Constitution. He's giving a series of lectures on law. And he imagines that he will be the American Blackstone, that he will educate a generation of American lawyers about the foundations of American law. And so he's taking that mindset as he gets into these lectures. And it's important for us, I think, for those reasons, to think about what he's saying. He delivers this first lecture, and some of the newspaper accounts of it describe that he's sitting in front of, this is Philadelphia, the U.S. Capitol is still there, Washington, D.C. has not been built yet, and so his audience includes George and Martha Washington, John Adams, both houses of Congress, both houses of the state legislature, and, as the newspaper articles say, a number of ladies and gentlemen. And so that's the audience for his first lecture on law as an endowed chair, and he says that the science of law should be, in some measure and in some degree, the study of every free citizen and every free man. And so he's thinking of this as a kind of citizenship education about the ideas that undergird society. And the stakes for these questions are therefore high, and it's telling then, given that backdrop, what he wants to accomplish, who he's talking to, what he thinks these lectures will be, that he begins in this first substantive lecture in this course with his students. He begins by broaching this philosophical and theological debate about the relationship between God and ethics. The question he brings up to his students is whether moral obligation originates in the reason of God or whether it originates in the will of God or in some combination between the two. It's familiar to the Euthyphro question. Those of you who have read Plato's Euthyphro, there's a similar kind of question debate that comes up there. And the stakes for this are high for him. On the one hand, if moral obligation originates in God's reason alone, then we seem to allow some kind of a disunity in God's nature. It submits God to a law that he doesn't create that's external to himself. If, on the other hand, moral obligation originates in God's will, then the content of ethics of what is good seems to be arbitrary, literally lacking a reason, and rooted in power alone as the sufficient cause of God's authority. If you're too young to remember Pink Floyd, but there's a line in a Pink Floyd song, God gets what God wants. That's this vision. God's powerful, God wants something, God gets it. Why this is important is because of the analogies that this has with how we think about political sovereignty. The middle way that Wilson suggests to his students is to recognize the unity of power and goodness in the divine nature such that God is subject to a law that he voluntarily imposes on himself. This sounds kind of like a sophisticated rationalization, but he's appealing to a tradition. In particular, there's a 16th century Anglican theologian named Richard Hooker that engages in all of these debates, and he appeals back to Hooker and quotes Hooker. And Hooker says this in his manner of speaking. He says, "They err, therefore, who think that of the will of God to do this or that, there's no reason beside his will. The idea would be that you unify both reason and will, power and goodness within the divine nature. And the reason Wilson brings all this up initially is because he's criticizing William Blackstone. He's criticizing Blackstone's definition of law. It was meant to be a clarification, if not a criticism, of the ambiguity that was in how Blackstone talked about law. When Blackstone gives his lectures, and he's asked to define what law is, he says that law is a rule of action which is prescribed by some superior in which the inferior is bound to obey. And so Wilson comes to that line in Blackstone. He's going to be the American Blackstone and put American law on a different footing. And he says, well, we have to clarify that. Being superior in power is not enough. And having a rule of action that's prescribed by a superior over an inferior is not enough, that it has to be united with goodness. And this insistence on divine power and goodness being united is an insistence that those two elements are part of the very definition of law. Power might be necessary, but it's not sufficient to establish and promulgate law authoritatively. And by analogy, this applies to human law as well, which finds its moral limits in the eternal law that emanates from the divine nature. And that sounds like a mouthful, but this is exactly what Martin Luther King had in mind when he was appealing to the eternal law and the natural law and offering to give a justification for the reasons why civil disobedience was justified in that instance, as he's giving an apology for the criticism that he receives while he's in Birmingham jail. And he appeals back and is rooted in this broader tradition in the American founding, this tradition that remained even in the 18th century, one of the dominant influences on the American founders, and a tradition that helps account for the ideas that drove the revolution and undergirded American jurisprudence and constitutionalism. And with that, let me pause. We have about 10 minutes, and I would love to have a conversation with you about these ideas and questions you have. Any brave souls? Yes, sir.
Just thinking about it because there was a lot of information. I feel like, what is the limit then on things that affect only the individual for law? Like something that only affects somebody in their personal at-home life. Like how does this justification for where law comes from originate? Like, how does that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So part of this is...
Justin, can you repeat the question?
Yes, so the question is about what are the limits on restrictions we might put on individuals? Is that what you have in mind? So if you have, and I think maybe what this is getting at is, what if you have things that you're not harming somebody, acting by yourself? Is that kind of what you have in mind? What would justify imposing rules or restrictions on individual behavior, something like that? Yeah, so it's kind of what is the limit of what law is, and what does all this mean for that? I guess I'd step back and say this. What I'm trying to get at through all of this is an answer to some of the really big questions and not the specific answer to the particular questions. So some of the big questions are things like this, precisely what King is getting at. Whether he's right or wrong about how he approaches it, maybe he's justified, maybe not, from disobeying the law, but he's getting at that question. Is there any moral content to the law? What's the relationship between morality and law? Is there a time that you're justified in disobeying the law? For legal authority, what would justify using legal authority in a certain kind of way? Are there limits to how you could use it? And I think maybe you're getting at, we might want to say, well, there are, just because we think that you're behaving in a way that's not right doesn't mean we should impose a vision on how we regulate individuals. Fair enough. But I think that argument still operates within the broad category of the assumption that there would be something wrong with using public authority to limit people's freedom in certain contexts or certain ways. And then you have to kind of step back and ask, well, why would that be wrong? If all ideas about what is good or right or justified just does come from the political authority, then there would be no basis on which to criticize the political authority for exercising power in a way that's unjust. And so it gets into that question, and then it takes you down other areas. Okay, if that's so, if there's a law that we expect other people to know or norms of morality that we expect other people to be able to appeal to and we should appreciate, where do they come from? How do we know them? Is it a matter of reason that we understand these things based on our reason? Is it a matter of sentiment that we share a common nature and we share common sentiments and we can appeal to each other on a kind of emotional level or on a level of empathy? Maybe we have common empathy based on common experience and we hope that that is the shared understanding that we have. And so I think all of these questions are on the table, and part of what this does is this study, I hope, helps show the degree to which the founders were both aware of those questions and deeply engaging them, and the degree to which all of that was connected with ideas about theology. And so let me, on the theology side, let me kind of say something that might help see the relevance of the theology aspect on this. Some of this, I think arguably, some of these theorists will have an argument about God and they'll have an argument about theology. There's a theological context for all of this. But if you drop God out of the conversation, which I think some of the theorists arguably probably wanted to do or were implicitly doing, Thomas Hobbes might be one example of that. He was accused by others in his own day of being an atheist, and certainly many people interpret him that way today. If you drop God out of it, all you're left with is a sovereign, a human political sovereign that's patterned after or modeled after this idea or archetype of a divine sovereign, even if the divine sovereign doesn't exist, if that makes sense. And so you have, an unlimited power in the divine sovereign, you have an unlimited power in the human sovereign. And so it becomes a recipe for thinking about political sovereignty and the way that we might organize a political community, what the limits are to that. And so today, all sorts of questions about, is there something that we say, just because you got 51% of the vote doesn't make it right? Okay, well, how do we then have that argument? And are there common standards that we can appeal to and reason about together? And all of those questions are very, very hard questions, but they're ones that are scattered throughout the political writings in this era. Question? Yes, ma'am.
Do you think there are other ways to model sovereignty besides based off divine sovereignty, how to if our modern political sovereignty is model after what is divine, are there any other ways that to model sovereignty besides the divine?
So say that one more time. There's the question about divine sovereignty.
Yeah. So you said that political sovereignty is modeled after divine sovereignty, even if you want to take away the God factor.
Yeah. Right.
So are there any other ways to model political sovereignty without the structure of the divine sovereignty?
Yeah, good question. So the question is about if the ideas of political sovereignty are modeled after conversations about divine sovereignty, are there ways to simply think about how to model political sovereignty without the question about divine sovereignty? Is that how you think about it? Yes, I think that's certainly a fair question and a fair way to think about this. Somebody in a Q&A, I got the response was, well, that's true that there's a modern turn toward unlimited sovereignty, the absolute sovereign state or sovereign political community. There's a modern turn toward that. But there's also potentially a modern response to that, which is the proliferation of human rights discourse. And maybe in the modern world, our discussion of human rights and human rights discourse is a way that we can limit political sovereignty and do it without reference. I think increasingly, particularly post-World War II, kind of modern human rights discourse, increasingly without reference to questions of theology. And I think the answer is, yeah, practically that's possible. We can do that. But it does still leave the human rights discourse conceptually as emanating from the political sovereign's will, if that makes sense on a conceptual level. It's still that we choose as a matter of will to create a human rights regime to limit government, but it doesn't offer you reasons to do that if you reject some of the much thicker, broader theoretical and theological background, I think, that arguably gave the impetus for those initial conversations. Don't know if that's helpful or makes sense. Thanks.